At this point, we're getting pretty close to finishing with the XSI portion of this training kit. Really about the only thing that we have left to do is to create just a little bit of animation that can then be taken to our game engine. Alright, so here's what we left off with in the previous lesson. So we have this character who's been fully enveloped, now been correctly weighted. Right, everything should be pretty much ready to go. So what I'm going to do is create just a quick little walk cycle animation, and then after that we'll talk about how we can actually bake this animation down onto these skeletal joints for being able to take these into our game engine. So usually I like to do my walk cycle at the duration of about 25 frames, just a little bit less than a second. So what I'm going to do is set my timeline down to 25 frames and start this actual walk cycle. So we'll make this a standing cycle, so the character won't actually move. He'll just stand in one place and do the actual walk cycle movement. So a lot of times what I like to do is start with the character in kind of a stepping pose. So what I can do is take these manipulators, pull these back, take this hip joint, pull this down a little bit, and try to get everything in pretty much a good starting pose. Now, one of the things I really like to do is to turn on XSI's automatic keyframing. And this saves me the trouble of having to remember to set a keyframe for each and every frame that I'm going to actually set one on. Now, be prepared because this is a little bit dangerous. If you're not careful, you could accidentally set a lot of keyframes in areas that you don't want to. So make sure whenever you have this automatic keyframe on that you use it carefully. Because as you can see, anytime I move my object, it will automatically set a keyframe in that area. You can see a keyframe has been set because this red little key, and also because you'll see a little red tick mark here in my timeline. So just be aware of that. So what I can do is take this little blue box, rotate this up to get the foot roll. Actually put this back a little bit further. There we are. We can take this foot roll, turn it back a little bit, and just sort of try to get him into a initial stepping pose. There we are. So something like that should do the trick. There we are. And now what I can do is go to the last frame. What I can do is just scroll down and set the same keyframes again. So if you have your manipulation tool set to any particular mode, in this case it's set to translate, which means we're setting translate keyframes. Now for these guys, I actually rotated these, so what I need to do is switch to my rotate tool, and now I can set rotation keyframes in those spots. And what we should see is two keyframes at either end of the timeline that are absolutely identical, and that's really what I want to be able to have. That will help ensure that the keyframes, or these cycles, whenever we loop this walk cycle, it's pretty much flawless. Alright, so let's go to a halfway point here. Let's say about frame 13. And let's take this to the other extreme. So we'll take this leg back. We can rotate this one up a little bit on his toes. And you can see because I have my automatic keyframe set, XSI is automatically setting a keyframe any place where it detects a change in the actual joints. Just need to make sure that you actually move the correct areas. So here we are. Have this little bit of a cycle happening. So what I really like to do is just layer these animations right on top. Just slowly start to build up. So at about the halfway point here, let's take this leg and raise this up. There, so that way the leg actually steps up. Do the same over here at about the halfway point, frame 19. We'll raise this leg upward. There we go. So, like I said, I really like to do a lot of this layering. Just start with the basic keyframes, or basic positions, and then come up and follow along behind those with more and more and more advanced movements. So for this area, again about frame 7, we'll want the hips to obviously raise up a little bit. So what I'll need to do is first keyframe the hips in their current position. So I'll just switch to my translate tool, set a keyframe, and then set another keyframe at the very end, so that way the hips stay in the exact same position. Right at about this point, frame 7, we'll want the hips to raise up a little bit. Once they come down at about frame 13, want to bring the hips back down. And then once again at about frame 19, we'll want the hips to raise up and create that kind of natural body movement. There we are. So now we actually have a little bit of up and down hip movement like what you would expect to see. Now these legs right now are a little bit far apart, as you can see. He's kind of got this wide stance. So what we can always do is come in, make a few adjustments to these feet. So I can come in, move this in, and so you can see it automatically now sets a keyframe for that. But what you'll see is now at the very end, these keyframes don't match up. If I were to loop this, you could really see this in action. So you can see the foot jump when it gets from the end of the timeline and then jumps back to the beginning. You can see this jump in the foot. So what we could do, we'll move this timeline back to frame 1, and then we can middle click down to frame 25. And you can see this little green tick mark. And now what I can do is update this with a new keyframe. And there we are. So what happens is you can go to a particular frame where everything is set just as you want it to be, and then by middle clicking, what we can do is go to a point in the timeline where we're not updating. So by middle clicking, we're moving through the timeline, but it's not actually updating anything. And so what we can do is go to a position where the foot is right where we want it, set a new keyframe, and that will override the existing keyframe with this new one that we just placed. So back here at frame 13, I'll pull this foot back in a little closer. And then at about frame 7, we'll pull this out. So that way the foot kind of goes out and around. There we are. Same as before with this foot, we'll pull this back in a little bit. And then I will middle click down to the end of my timeline to make sure that this doesn't update. And then now just override the keyframe that was there with the new keyframe. Go to about frame 13, pull this leg in a little closer. There we are. So now he sort of steps forward instead of having this wide kind of goose step. There we are, much better. So if I play this back, you can sort of see what we wind up with now. All right, and we have a nice rhythmic walk cycle. All right, so before we wrap up with this particular lesson, let's add just a little bit more to these hips. All right, you can see the hips are pretty static as they are right now. So let's add just a little bit of weight shifting. Here we are. So when the foot is straight, you'll want to add just a little bit of weight shifting back into this area. So let's shift the weight of the foot over here. There we are. So we'll just grab that hip control, shift that over. Now back on this other side, we'll shift the weight over a little bit more to this side. There we are. So now we actually get a little bit of weight transfer going between there. Otherwise, this guy would pretty much just kind of topple over as he was taking a step. So right in these areas where you've got the foot or the body weight being balanced on a particular foot, always remember to try to shift that weight over onto that leg. Just like that. There we go. Much more natural. So you can start to see how this layering effect really kind of just make things much, much simpler and a little bit easier to kind of get through. So what I'm going to do is go ahead and stop the lesson at this point, and in the next lesson we'll work on some of the more complete body movements, so things like the arms, the head, and some of these follow-through movements as well. And then we'll pretty much be wrapped up with the XSI portion of this training kit.